Hello there, my name is Elsa Peterson, and for my final project topic, I'm going to be talking about the role of protests in American history. To start off, I googled the Wikipedia definition of protest, and it says it's a statement or action expressing disapproval of or objection to something. And thanks to our First Amendment right, U.S. citizens have the right to protest whatever they may please if they do not express threats, obscenity, violence, or malicious intent. We learned in this class that protesting is a negative right, yet what we have seen in 2020 so far is sort of blurring the lines for me. I also learned that the purpose of the First Amendment is to have robust ideas and debate. But right now, our country is protesting and further debating the systemic oppression of the Black community relative to the police brutality, and unfortunately, some protesters need to debate racism. Protesting in America reaches back all the way to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. This protest was not entirely peaceful, however. According to the History Channel website, there are at least 10 facts most people do not know about the Boston Tea Party incident. To summarize, the so-called protesters disagreed with the Tea Act's 3 pence per pound legislation. The East India Company, which is the company selling the tea to America, was going to reduce tea taxes by over half the price, but Townshend Acts in 1767 agitated the colonists. The history article says, in quotes, "The principle of self-governance, not the burden of higher taxes, motivated political opposition to the Tea Act." The article also mentions how protesters against the Tea Act were fed up because of commercial reasons rather than political principles. And to elaborate a little bit on that quote, the East India Company undercut the price of smuggled Dutch tea and ended up creating a monopoly within tea trade. John Hancock was a key citizen fomenting the revolt, according to the article as well. And it's interesting to realize that protests in 1773 and beyond have specific organizers that may or may not go unnoticed. I think our future history books will know the names of George Floyd, someone who did not start the protest, but was the reason. However, I'd like to know the specific people who organized these protests because they deserve to be in the books too. Another thing relevant that we learned in this class is the case of Valentine versus Christensen, which kind of explains that we have no privacy expectations outside of your home. And when you're protesting, a lot of people don't want to be seen on, video footage or like camera roll footage or on the news because it can potentially affect where you're working. I've seen a lot of people when they're recording protests, they blur out their footage because they want to protect the privacy rights of other people protesting. So going back to what I was saying before, people who organize these protests, maybe they'll be in the history books, maybe they won't, depending on what kind of privacy they want to deal with. But moving forward, I want to talk about how some things have changed because of social media. So back in 1774, during the Boston Tea Party, after it happened, George Washington believed the protesters of the Boston Tea Party should compensate the East India Company for all the tea that was destroyed. And I know that was over 200 years ago, but I want to kind of compare it to today. Our president takes his voice to Twitter and threatens looters of the George Floyd protest will be shot by police. I remember the tweet said, the last sentence was, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." So the British Parliament enacted the Intolerable Acts after the Boston Tea Party, so the colonists created the First Continental Congress. And since 1774, and even before that, I would say, disagreeable government action has always sparked real change, and that's something I'm looking forward to in 2020. In my opinion, I think that a lot of peaceful protests, like most of them I would say, have the potential for violent sparks to outbreak. And I want to talk about a couple of older violent protests like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. So Shays Rebellion is another example of the history of protests in America. Peaceful means from former Revolutionary War soldiers turned violent when the state of Massachusetts ignored documents of grievances and reform, according to a History Channel article. So then next, town leaders began to block judges from entering courthouses in Northampton and Worcester. The protest then escalated when Samuel Adams called for he called for rebellion's execution, although a few judges were in favor of the peaceful part of the rallies. So imagine if President Trump just wanted to execute members of the protest. That would be kind of crazy, but that's what Samuel Adams, he wasn't the president, but that is what he was calling for during Shays' Rebellion. So the history article mentions Justice William Whiting accusing the wealthy state legislators of making money off the impoverished farmers and claiming the farmers were obligated to disrupt government in response. So this reminds me kind of Mitt Romney supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and marching with protesters, yet still being ridiculed by President Trump over Twitter. So then numerous bills were passed, in quotes, excusing sheriffs from responsibility if they killed any insurgents and declaring harsh punishments for rebels in custody, end quote. Soon after, the legislators suspended the writ of habeas corpus for a period of time. And then another bill prescribed the death penalty for militiamen who took part in the protest of Shays' Rebellion. And I should have mentioned earlier that people were protesting in the first place because economic policies were causing poverty and property foreclosures, and there was a lot of debt-ridden citizens who had to go to jail eventually, and so people were protesting that because they just thought it wasn't right, and the leader of the protest was Daniel Shays, and that's why it is called the Shays' Rebellion. And as you could imagine, because those bills that I spoke about earlier were enacted, that's when protests seemed to turn more violent. So it's kind of ironic that the British Parliament, passed these bills to execute citizens who were protesting, yet people just got more violent. They started blocking the judges from entering the courthouses, and they just had no means to move their crops and make money to pay off debts and taxes. So a lot of authorities began to arrest the farmers and foreclose on all their farms, and that just ended up making things worse, and the protests lasted for almost a year. And to wrap up Shays' Rebellion, in 1787, newly elected Governor John Hancock passed legislation that placed a moratorium on debts and cut taxes, easing the economic burden the rebels were struggling to overcome. And that is a direct quote from the History Channel article. And some rebels were executed, and then some of the upper levels were just paraded to gallows before release, and then a lot were eventually pardoned. Daniel Shays was a specific one that was pardoned after being arrested for rebelling. So now I want to talk about an article based on Pride. It is Pride Month this month, and the article is written by Kitty Stryker. Police present at any protest in general is an issue to some, especially in 2020, with the difficulty of what constitutes as a peaceful protest, and even more so because of the riots in 2020. They are against police brutality toward Black individuals. So LGBTQ members express in this article the experience of PTSD because cops in uniform were marching or on duty during the Pride Parade. And this is a direct quote from the article. It says, in 1992, former Portland Police Chief Tom Potter participated in a Pride Parade to support his daughter Katie, an officer and a lesbian, and many of his fellow officers turned their backs on him. Kitty Stryker, I think, puts in that quote because there's kind of a debate in this article between LGBTQ members who are traumatized by police being at parades, and then there's some police officers who wish to be at these parades because they want to support, their family members or people that are close to them. But a lot of LGBTQ members have been harassed by police officers, and they're slightly triggered when they walk in these pride parades. And pride parades are very different from protests. Obviously there's a difference between a protest and a parade, but pride parades are usually very happy. There's loud music, there's confetti, there's singing, there's dancing, there's smiles. And protests, there's kind of the opposite of that. But going back to kind of why LGBTQ members began Pride parades in general, it actually came from a riot. It's the Stonewall riots in 1969, and they're cited as the beginning of LGBTQ resistance against law enforcement, according to Stryker in the article. These riots are not considered protests, in my opinion, because they were violent and spontaneous. And the riots lasted 6 days and were the result of a police force raiding a homosexual club called the Stonewall Inn. And the Stonewall riots are technically illegal, but protesting without violence is not. And according to Stryker, Pride was born in opposition of the police. To kind of wrap things up, because I am going over my 10-minute mark, I want to say that, what's happened in the past, protesting in America, violence or no violence, it has sparked some kind of change. I'm thinking of Rosa Parks and the bus boycott that happened for over 300 days. That was nonviolent, and that was the start of the civil rights movement. Now people are protesting all across America in every 50 states for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and all those other people, and I think it's a great thing if they aren't violent, and now there's talk of defunding the police and all of that stuff. I think that this is really going to spark a change. It's not going to be like other times. I think this is going to go down in history as one of the most important protests in the history of America, and I hope everyone goes to the polls and votes. But yeah, all in all, I think that protesting in America is one of the most effective, one of the most brave methods to enact change in our country.